Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Vlogging podcast. This is the second time go at this. I just had a bandwidth issue, so I just restarted. But let me just jump straight into it. Every week we do like to do this vlogging podcast. I'm really just trying to wrap up news from ZP for this week. One of the first things that we want to talk about is that ZP will be talking at a Faraday conference. A Faraday conference, you're often invited to speak, or you can be invited to speak. You can also submit. On this occasion, ZP was invited, and then we have to do this kind of submission, and we're going to talk about electrosynthesis. Electrosynthesis is kind of interesting to see because for me, it's just a difference in scale that I personally started my career actually doing electroorganic synthesis, and then sort of went into electroanalysis. Although electroanalysis, whenever you're doing synthesis, you often do electroanalysis at the same time. You certainly taught it. But it's really just a difference in scale. So if you're making a measurement on chilies, for example, you could be making that measurement and you could call that analysis. If you increase the electrode size rather, then you could be transforming the capsaicin in chili into a new product, and that would actually be a synthesis. So for us, the difference between synthesis and analysis is just really application and scale. Often we're involved in electrochemistry and we happen to be doing it on the sort of analysis side of things, but if you scale up the electrodes, for example, it can actually become a synthesis effort. But we're happy to be talking at the Faraday discussion, and that will be in Edinburgh on the 12th to the 14th of July. It's quite nice because we're able to go up to Scotland, and we're able to then also meet with other colleagues there as well, in Glasgow and in Edinburgh. We do our ZP Developer Zone webinar every Thursday at 8 a.m. London time. We ask for questions, or we gather questions that have come in during the week. And the questions that come in, and we try to make some slides around those. So this week we talk about accuracy of HPLC. HPLC is a great technique, but once you start dealing with real samples like chili powders, it's not anywhere as precise and accurate as people really think it is. We did talk about chemiresistors, and we have put an extra note out about chemiresistors. We do talk about sensors for metallic elements. Seems to have really gathered, at least on YouTube, some interest that people are interested in looking at metals and ions. We were asked about making a sensor for glutamate, and we were able to discuss that as well. And also the use of our pH sensors as well. And I think there was a follow-up question on the pH sensors. pH sensors are, I don't want to trivialize it, but they're quite straightforward, at least the ZP ones, to use. So we do like to do that webinar every Thursday, 8 a.m. London time, and it will happen this Thursday as well. Questions are always constant at ZP, and we're happy to do it. As I say, we did put an extra note out about chemiresistors this week. I think chemiresistor, it's really interesting that you've got kind of these classes of these kind of electronic biosensors. You've got biosensors that ZP deals with, which are sort of classic electrochemical sensors. And then you have transistor type sensors, and then you have these chemiresistors as well. I think there's the similarity between them is much greater than people really realize. We're all working on the same technology. We just have different language sometimes and different ways of getting the signal out. But anyway, this chemiresistor really has sort of, in one form of it, it has two electrodes, and there's an electrolyte between them, and the electrolyte might be quite solid. And some sort of analyte comes in, interacts with the electrolyte, and the resistance of the electrolyte changes, and that's measured by these two resistors. So, it's, I don't want to trivialize it, but it's similar to a lot of electrochemical techniques. I think people even talk about IV curves. When people talk about IV curves, current versus voltage, it really sounds like linear sweep voltammetry to me. And if we cycled back again, you'd call that cyclic voltammetry as well. So at ZP, we do cover all these various forms, if I can put it that way, of all these various forms of these electronic biosensors. Something that we've been working hard on and actually put a lot of investment into is malic acid sensors, malate and malic acid sensors. so we have this malic acid sensor. It's has a sort of a lot of applications in the food and beverage industry. It's interesting actually because I think I'm trying to just think about the applications in the medical industry, but I'm not so sure on the medical industry. But we do have it. We have put a lot of let's say investment into it. And when I said it has applications in the food and beverage industry, for example, it can be used in trying to detect the adulteration of pomegranate juice. So pomegranate juice is a kind of well, it's obviously a juice of pomegranates, but I think it's considered sort of, it's a more expensive juice, and in order to cut costs, people adulterate it by diluting it with apple. But I think pomegranates, or apple juice, I should say, but pomegranates don't have necessarily a lot of malic acid in them, but apple juice does have a lot of malic acid in it. So when you do this adulteration, i.e. you dilute the pomegranate juice with apple juice, you do end up introducing malic acid, and so you can sort of spot that adulteration by just checking the malic acid concentration. So it's kind of a nice example of our malic acid sensor there. I've also been doing and thinking a lot more about glucose sensors. I mean, I think ZP is sort of so famous for glucose sensing that we tend not to talk about it quite so much. But in fact, I think we will start talking about it a lot more, because we always talk about glucose in the context of human health and in particular diabetes. But glucose, for example, is useful in agriculture. So, for example, if potatoes have a high sugar content, they may not be so useful in preparing potato chips or crisps, depending on where you are. But when you sort of slice these potatoes very thinly, and then you sort of fry them and produce that kind of crispy snack, if they've got too high a glucose content in them, I think they don't fry well, and I think they actually sort of blacken. It may be the same for when people make French fries as well, that these things can blacken. So you have to know the sugar content, and if it's too high, they're not good for frying. So I know ZP does do a lot of glucose sensors, and people know us for it, but I just wanted to talk about applications that were essentially outside of just human health monitoring, and sugars in potatoes is one of those applications. Something else that's interesting in the food and beverage industry is actually total sugars. So total sugars kind of includes glucose, fructose, maltose, all the other, let's say, sugars as well. So when people talk about, we make a glucose sensor, it's very specific to glucose, but in the food industry, you might want to know what the total sugars are, which would include at least fructose as well. And so we actually do have a sensor that's, it's very interesting because we try to make sensors that are specific, put an enzyme on them, make them specific to glucose, put an enzyme on them, make them specific to fructose. In this application, we actually want to be broadly applicable to the sugars. So we have actually got an electrochemical total sugars sensor as well. Staying on the food and sugars application, as I've sort of said now, glucose is a important molecule in medicine, biotech, industry, and obviously food. And so we've sort of trying to highlight the extra applications that these glucose sensors have in wider industry, rather than just in the medical space. It's kind of interesting because once you step away from human health, in fact, most of the other applications have sugar in a much higher concentration. So it's interesting that the sensors that we design for human health actually have application in other spaces. But in doing that, you sometimes have to increase the linear range as well, which we've been pretty good at, let's say, doing. So if I was to summarize the week, obviously we do this podcast every Sunday, but then during the week we also do the ZP Developer Zone webinar, and as part of that, we do talk about the activities that we're also up to, and one of the activities that we're up to in July is this Faraday conference. Some of the other things that we have, or news that we have put out there this week, it's been a lot around glucose, measuring sugars, and the really the industries that these sugars kind of find themselves in as well. And is related to this that we have a malic acid sensor. We've put quite a lot of effort in the malic acid sensor. And, when you're looking and talking about what can malic acid be used for, well, it is an additive in lots of foods. And it's also worth noting that it's a good way of spotting adulteration, for example, in pomegranates. So I will wrap up there. As I say, this was the second go at this webinar this morning. I had a bit of a bandwidth issue, but I hope that didn't cause people too many problems. If you've got any questions of ZP, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Every Thursday, 8 a.m. London time, we will do the webinar. And of course, we just do this wrap up on our news during every Sunday at 8 a.m. London time. Any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, thanks very much.